we have already discussed this morning about, and actually also in the early sessions this afternoon, about many of the challenges that artificial intelligence is causing for labor. So I won't repeat them all. I'm just summarizing them here. So we talked about transparency and accountability of decisions made by algorithms. We talk about monitoring and surveillance. We talk about data extraction and data protection. We talk about work intensification and extensification due to AI technologies. And at the more macro level, we also talked about the risk of replacement of humans due to AI. We talk about decentralization of work processes. And we also talked in the very last session also about the atomization and individualization of work. And of course, all related to this, also the increased inequalities that all these processes cause. So what I'm going to do in this brief talk is actually to talk about 3 case studies from the research that me and my colleagues at Fair Work have been pursuing in the past 6 years, just to see a little bit how do these challenges play out in practice, and what does it really mean for unions and for collective representation more generally. So I'm going to start with the so-called canary in the coal mine, which is platform work. Platform work, we have already discussed today, has been the first form of work where AI has been heavily involved in the management, in the organization, in the control of this form of work. And we've already talked a lot about platform work in this past few sessions. What I want to remind everyone is that platform work is not just transport and food delivery. There's much more work that is being platformized these days. There are psychotherapists working through digital platforms, designers, translators, domestic services, if you need house repairs, cleaning, tutoring, house sitting, babysitting, and so on. They're all done by platforms these days. And what are the challenges? We have already mentioned decentralization of work. I mean, most of these workers work without a workplace. They just work through their phone. It's a very atomized, individualized work experience. Many of these workers think about workers who work online, for example, might never meet their co-workers or their colleagues working for the same platform. And I think this is important for collective representation, there's a lot of competition between workers. Workers think about, for example, online work, they might bid against each other to get a shot at a certain job. So competition is the norm rather than comparison between co-workers in the platform economy. And of course, we have already mentioned this, the lack of an employment relationship. Many of these platforms at least claim to be just an intermediary. As you can see this from an article from the Washington Post, ride-hailing app Uber claims to have no drivers. Uber even claims not to be a transportation company, but just to be a tech company. And Lyft, which is the example you can see below, which is, if you don't know, Lyft is the second largest transport company in North America. This is taken from their legal website and says Lyft does not provide transportation services, at least is not a transportation carrier. So this idea that really they're far removed from the role of an employer in the traditional sense of the term, together with the obligation and responsibility that would come with an employer role. And of course, we've discussed this again earlier. The boss is the algorithm. So algorithms have taken over a lot of the management, control, monitoring, and evaluation functions that were previously done by humans, with problems when it comes to biases and discrimination, lack of transparency and accountability. I think the previous speaker talked about the algorithmic black box, like that we don't know how these decisions are made, what kind of data feed into the decisions taken by the algorithm and why. And of course, lack of due process and human oversight. A lot of these decisions are automated without workers being able to have a human revising this decision or renegotiating this decision or appealing to these decisions. And finally, but not least important, is also the problem of data protection. We've seen, for example, that AI allows like a very pervasive minute to minute, second by second of the performance of the worker, what the worker is doing, where he's doing it, at which pace, at which speed, and for how long. And of course, they extract large amount of data from the workers with important implication for data protection. So what does it all mean for unions in the platform economy? Well, first of all, there is a need to reach, unionize, and mobilize workers. I think in the previous section was mentioned that these workers are very scattered, they're very dispersed. Food delivery riders, you can find them on the street, but domestic workers, you cannot find them on the street. You don't know who domestic workers are. Online workers, you don't know where they are, where they work, and how they work. But also there are some other characteristics, such as social demographic characteristics, which are not familiar with trade union representation. Many of these workers are young. They don't have any sort of previous experience with collective representation. They're not familiar with unions. They grew up in a very individualized neoliberal era, where the individual is key and there's not much room for collective representation. But also there are a lot of migrants, for example. They might come from countries in which there's not much tradition or history of collective representation. So might not be familiar with the fact that they have collective rights and they have the possibility of being collectively represented. And then, of course, a lot of people also come from ethnic minority. You can also see from these rooms, you don't see a lot of non-white faces. So it can be difficult. It can be challenging for somebody who's from an ethnic background to be represented. And to trust somebody who comes from a different background than theirs. And of course, a lot of these occupations were never previously represented with workers. Again, with the example by unions. With the example of Pizza Express, which were the 90s version of Deliveroo. There were no unions for Pizza Express, around the world. So a lot of these categories, occupation, are really new when it comes to collective representation. So what are the union's responses? Traditional union, and this is like my small critique here, have been a bit slow to react to the phenomenon of platform work. And in a sense, grassroots workers' association and workers' collective have really stepped in at the very beginning, to first unionize and mobilize platform workers, although only for some categories. As I said before, when it comes to collective representation, we're mostly talking about transport and delivery, but not other workers, such as in the domestic sector or online occupation. And now, as we've seen from some examples today, also more traditional established unions have done some catch-up, but of course there's still much more room to go, and still much more to be done. And I'm glad, that one prominent union is organizing this sort of conference on this. But a second challenge for union is the technical side. Like AI technology require ad hoc expertise that has not been traditional part of the realm of knowledge of unions. Unions are not filled with computer scientists, statisticians, informatic engineers who know much about these technologies. And even if they have, a lot of these algorithms are covered by proprietary rules. So like platforms say, well, you cannot see the coding, you cannot see the algorithms because this is part of my copyright. So it's very difficult to even know what the algorithm is, how it functions, and what are the outcomes that these algorithms can produce for workers. And so some of these problems are at least partly new for unions. Unions were not used to negotiate for an algorithm. They were not used to deal with issues of data protection, at least not on the scale that we're used to in the platform economy and more generally in the digital economy. So what are unions' responses? Well, some unions in some countries, we heard before the example of Italy, have been able to start negotiating the algorithms. Like the algorithm, because it's part of the management function, it's part of the control and monitoring function that happen at work, can be negotiated as other working conditions can be negotiated. In a sense, they have been able to open the algorithmic black box to collective representation and to collective negotiation and collective bargaining. But of course, the unions, and this is a challenge really, is to build skills and expertise to really deal with this. Unions are not used, as I said, to have computer scientists and engineers, and I'm not saying they should become startups or tech companies themselves, but they need to build in capacities and skills to really be able to fully understand, what AI means for workers. And in a sense, legislation is helping in this regard. We've mentioned the Digital Act of the European Union, we've mentioned the European Platform Directive, although of course, this is only a start. There might be, like a lot more legislation and regulations that will need to be implemented to really have it properly regulated. And finally, but not least important, the issue of representing the self-employed. Like in some countries, for example, France, Poland, Ireland, the UK, there are several barriers for unions to collectively bargain for self-employed workers, to collectively represent self-employed workers. That's not the case in other European countries, but of course, legislation in these countries represents a very relevant barrier. And of course, the way the unions are, at least the more traditional unions are structured, the way they are organized, and even the culture of the union, is ill-adapted to these new forms of work. So what are the union responses? Well, as I was saying earlier, legislation is making progress, and in a sense is becoming more favorable to the representation and the collective bargaining from unions. And of course, union confederation have created, for example, separate federation for non-standard workers or for self-employed workers or branches within federations. However, and I'm going to repeat this once again, some categories of platform workers, such as cloud worker or domestic worker, still remain very much a non-union land. They are really not represented by anyone. And here I come to the second example, which is because not all AI-driven work resembles platform work. AI is entering, as we have seen this morning, also more traditional workplaces. Like everybody is, I think one of the speakers earlier was saying, everybody's using AI to some extent. Everybody uses at least ChatGPT when they want to write an email and they're a bit too tired to answer that one, okay? And here I give one example that my colleagues have analyzed in the UK, particularly in the Midlands, near Birmingham, Coventry, and Nottingham, which is the example of Amazon warehouses, or fulfillment center, as they're called by Amazon. I don't know if you know, but basically the brain behind the huge global Amazon logistics system is called SCOT, and it means Supply Chain Optimization Technologies. So these are digital technologies, mostly run through AI technologies that really manage the supply and demand of products. They govern delivery times, they govern the way a warehouse should be stocked, like traveling time, and so on and so forth. And through SCOT, the whole logistics system of Amazon is managed, including the workers, as we will see in a second. But let's start with the good side, because we have discussed a lot of the challenges of AI, but there are also some good sides of AI. There are, of course, improvements in efficiency and productivity through the implementation of these digital technologies. Although, and this is a big problem when it comes to inequality, not all the increases in efficiency and productivity are really being redistributed equally between capital and labor. And also when it comes to health and safety, there's been a reduction of bodily toil through kind of heavy robotization, like Amazon warehouses and some of the most sophisticated and advancedly robotized, warehouses in the world. There's been a reduction of bodily toil because workers, for example, don't have to lift heavy weight anymore. The robots can do this for them. They don't have to walk. Before the implementation of this technology, they had to walk up to 15 kilometers per day within the warehouse. Now they can simply stay in the same place because the robots do most of the work for them. And related to this, also a reduction in injuries and workplace accidents. Like Amazon management, we were not able to verify this, but Amazon management claims that through the implementation of this digital and AI advanced technology, they've reduced accidents of up to 50% compared to before the implementation. But there's also some key challenges. And here I want to bring really the voice of one of the workers that my colleagues have interviewed. Of course, the names is not the real one. And one of the workers says, when the robots came, they made the job worse, because they are very fast. They don't give you a chance to breathe sometimes. To be honest, it's non-stop. So workers, not only they have to work alongside robots, and of course robots don't get tired, or at least they don't get tired as fast, as quickly as humans do, so they don't have to stop. And I didn't mention before, but Amazon uses basically a performance tracker called ADAPT, which stands for Associates Development and Tracking Technology, or something on those lines. Sorry, I don't remember exactly. And workers are constantly monitored. The performance is constantly monitored through this system. And if you receive a positive ADAPT, then all is good. You can continue doing your job. But if you receive a negative ADAPT, there might be negative consequences. You might be called up by the managers. If you receive too many negative ADAPTs, your contract might not get renewed, or you might get fired. And of course, the way these ratings, these ADAPT work, is not transparent. So here is another example from Said, who says, we don't really understand the rate system ourselves. All we know is you have to work like hell, that you can generate a big rate, and then you're probably safe. But you're not certain to be safe, because you don't really know what kind of data go into this rating. How does these data are elaborated and analyzed to produce, the rating that I receive. So there's a lot of opacity and very little accountability on the way these workers are evaluated. And also surveillance and monitoring. Here is an example, one of our female workers who says the managers know how much you've scanned, how much idle time you've had, and when you're not scanning, stuff like that, what you scan, where you scan, they know everything. So really pervasive monitoring and a lot of data extraction from the workers. We've also, several problems when it comes to data protection. And finally, but not least important, and this is, this is also an older problem, which has nothing to do with AI per se, but of course is closely tied with AI-based evaluation system. And it's the fact that Amazon uses a lot of temporary workers. They use a lot of so-called seasonal associates who are hired for months at a time to account for the fluctuations in demand, and the number is, of course, decided by Scott, which we met a few slides ago. And of course, securing an extension or a permanent status or a renewal of your contract depends on this rate, together with attendance and together with the general behavior. Again, not necessarily in a transparent and predictable way. And of course, there is a more general problem of job replacement. This is Adam, another Amazon associate, who says there are a lot of people within Amazon that have been there a while, they are on light duty. That means they can't lift heavy weights or heavy things. But now, obviously, with automated picking coming in, this is taking them out of the job. So robotization is really having an impact, and of course there are, according to Amazon management, there are speculation that only a very small number of workers and engineers will be needed in the years to come, because most of the, Amazon warehouses will basically become almost fully automated, or at least they will need many fewer workers. So what does it all mean, again, for unions? In a sense, Amazon warehouses is still a warehouse. It looks much more like a traditional workplace than an Uber driver or an online workers. So some of the challenges are really old, we've seen this, for example, the issue with the overuse of temporary contract and seasonal contracts. And some, of course, are instead new. The issue of data extraction, data protection, the issue of non-transparent algorithmic management, the issue of non-transparent, non-accountable ratings are actually new. So it's really a mixture of old and new challenges. And one of the key challenges, at least in the UK, has been the fact that Amazon has historically been against collective representation. So this is very much an old challenge. Employers not wanting to negotiate with the trade union is as old as the trade unions themselves. And Amazon has been claiming, they've been raising income. They also provide employees with discounts code, with income protection, with life insurance. They also have a notice board where workers can post questions and complain. So they say we don't really need a union. Okay. And of course, some of the workers disagree. And here we have Amir, who says, one of my leads said, oh, have you seen this leaflet on the table? And I go, what leaflet? He goes, it's basically you scan this barcode, and it tells you a bit more about the union. And if you want to leave the union, you can do it by using this barcode. So this is properly union-busting, activity, or making it very difficult for unions to really represent workers. Of course, the situation is not the same in other countries. We heard before from one of the previous presenters, there's been an historic agreement between Amazon and unions. In the UK, we haven't been able to do that yet. However, the GMB union, has been very active, and put a lot of effort to organize and mobilize workers in Amazon warehouse. And for example, they've done many campaigns, for example, having a minimum wage of £15 per hour, which is considered, like not only the minimum to survive on, but also based on the physical exertion of the type of job that these warehouse workers are suffer from. And then finally, there's also a third category of workers. We are at the stage not of the AI deployment, but of the AI development. When you think about AI, you might, your stereotype is like, who develops AI? AI is probably some engineer, some geek, somewhere in Silicon Valley, sitting in a fancy office, maybe in Cupertino or in San Francisco, doing some coding on their Mac, and creating AI. But AI models are actually created by millions and millions of workers who prepare the data, clean the data, annotate the data, label the data, so they create the data set upon which the AI models can be trained. And these are not very high, well-paid engineers from Silicon Valley. These are workers based mostly in the global south, in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, who do these jobs mostly from home, and a lot of micro work. So they click and they prepare the data, in a very, tiring and effortful way. So there's a lot of ghost work that people don't talk about that really feeds the so-called AI machine. So the engineer in Silicon Valley is only the tip of the iceberg of all this production of AI models and AI systems. And generally, there are two types of workers that do this data work. One is micro workers, so they work very similarly to the online workers I mentioned earlier when I was talking about platform work. But there are also a lot of companies, so-called business processing outsourcers, that do most of the data work. A lot of these companies started as formerly call centers, and now they focus all their effort on this form of work. And as AI models become more complex, they become more pervasive in different sectors of the economy, these BPOs are also specializing in different areas. For example, one of the BPOs that we studied in Uganda, was focusing only to do the modeling, the AI modeling for automated vehicle, for example. And these workers do really a lot of the tiring and, time-consuming work to make these AI models that then we can use easily, when you open Google or when you open your social media feed, that really feeds into these models. So they do, as I was saying earlier, the data collection, the data annotation, the data cleaning, the model testing, but also the content moderation. The fact that if you scroll on your social media, you don't see a lot of, sometimes it happens, but you don't see a lot of violent images, or you don't see a lot of pornographic images, like a lot of this content can be filtered out. It's not just been filtered out automatically by the system, it's also been filtered out maybe by a worker in Ghana or in India or in Brazil who has been checking these images to make sure that you don't see what you're not supposed to see. So what are the challenges of this form of work? Here are just two of the people that my colleagues have interviewed in Kenya, for example. And of course, the issue of work intensification and extensification. So here's one example who says they are under a lot of stress to do the work. Some people might skip lunch. They work extra overtime. When ramp down comes, they don't want to be on the list that gets cut. Again, an association between precarity and insecurity, because a lot of these companies use very precarious, very short-term contracts, sometimes contracts of no longer than a week. Like there are people who've been working for years, sometimes for the same company, on weekly contracts. Of course, issues of data protection, we mentioned this before. Issue of transparency and accountability of algorithms, because all these workers are rated. I mean, here you have the second interview who says, if you did not perform or improve your stats, related to your rating, the company will not renew the contract. It's purely based on the scores. And the scores that, again, you don't really understand how these are made. They're not transparent. They're not accountable. If there's a mistake, you don't know there is a mistake. There's no union to talk to. And of course, also the mental health impact of content moderation. Like imagine there are workers out there that filter, select and cancel images of violence, of war, or pornographic images, a lot of very, abusive images, for hours and hours per day without any sort of mental health support. So what does it mean, again, for unions? So there are many of the same challenges we discussed earlier. I'm not going to repeat them here, because many of them are really literally the same ones. But there are also some additional ones. A lot of these micro workers are really difficult to reach. There might be people in that building or that building, working as micro workers. You simply don't know where they are, where they work from, how much work do they do, how much do they earn, for how many hours a week. We don't simply know this. So there's a lot of invisibility of these workers. So where are unions supposed to find this work and organize them? And of course, there is a deep atomization of the work experience, even more than in the more traditional platform economy, because workers literally work from home. They work from their phone, they work from their laptop. There's no way, they can meet other co-workers. And of course, many of these workers are located outside national jurisdiction. So a company based here in Brussels, might have a project and might employ a lot of these workers, maybe from 15 or 20 different countries working on the same project for the same client. So how do you organize these workers who are, literally based in different countries who might not even speak the same language? And of course, they are under different jurisdictions, so different legislation, different regulations when there are. Okay, so this becomes very, very, very difficult for union. And again, some challenges are also partly new. The exposure to harmful online content. Of course, there are other jobs where people are exposed to harmful content, but not to the same extent as in the case, for example, for content moderation. And another issue is, of course, as I was mentioning earlier, the issue of a global job market. How do you organize workers that are scattered around the world, mostly working from their home? So what's union responses? Well, unfortunately, when it comes to this, there's not much happening. There's not much union collective representation for these kind of workers. And of course, we've seen why. There's a lot of very prominent, very powerful barriers to collectively organize and regulate these forms of work. Some help might come from new and upcoming due diligence legislation. That the European Union has recently approved a due diligence directive where firms, companies operating in the European Union, they will also need to have a check, a monitoring of the working condition along their supply chain, including their AI supply chain. So also data work will be included in these forms of work. How this might translate in practice, how will the checks and monitoring will be done, we don't know yet. And so I'll just conclude here. I'm not saying anything new when I say AI is here to stay. Like more and more jobs are going to be affected by AI. Of course, there are some old challenges, like the company not wanting to negotiate with the union, the use of short-term contract to really raise the productivity of the workers. And some are completely new, issue of data extraction, non-transparency of the algorithms, and so on are actually very new challenges. And of course, there is a regulatory, really wild west, where firms and companies and platforms are not breaking the law simply because there's no law to be broken. However, as I've seen, and I mentioned some example in my talk, but there have also been some examples earlier in the conversation today, that there is some catching up. There is some legislation, there is some regulations that can also help and support union activity in this regard. And some conclusions specifically for unions, and I want to reiterate, and I'm really glad that we are all here today, because really unions have a vital, more than important, it's really a vital role to play in improving the working conditions and to collectively represent these workers around the world. And this is like, I was asked to be a bit critical, so I'll just give a bit of a critique here. Unions also need to be willing to get out of the comfort zone. They cannot just say, oh, these workers are not they're not my constituency, they're not the kind of workers, I've traditionally represented, because a lot of these workers will be increasingly working alongside many of these workers. They will be competing for their jobs with a lot of these workers. So union cannot just sit back and look what's happening. And of course, they need to find new ways. We've seen the example of negotiating the algorithm, like new ways to really engaging in collective bargaining and collectively, represent these workers, but also rediscover old ones. We've seen the example of grassroots unions that were the first one to really go out there on the street, and really like contact the workers, convince them that joining a union is a good thing and that collective representation is a potential solution to their problems. So really going back a little bit to the very beginning of unionism, back to the 19th century, where a lot of these unions were actually grassroots unions. So there's a bit of work to do on that side. And here I'll say thanks and good luck to all the unions for this.